Ever scroll through the news and feel like today's economy is, well, just a bit unfair? Like maybe a handful of billionaires have just a little too much power and the rest of us are kind of just trying to scrape by? Well, hold on to your hats, because we're about to jump straight back in time to 1870s America. Welcome to an era of absolutely extreme cultural division, massive political corruption, and a time when we came dangerously close to one single guy literally owning the whole shebang.
Okay, let's dive into this. The term we use for this wild era is the Gilded Age. And fun fact, it was actually coined by the legendary writer Mark Twain. Now, gilded doesn't mean solid gold. It means something is covered in this very thin, very shiny layer of gold. But underneath, it's actually just rotting wood and, old socks. America looked like this glittering, shining success story on the outside, but the reality on the inside was completely different.
And this extreme wealth gap brilliantly illustrates exactly what we mean by that veneer versus reality. On the outside, hey, the sun is shining. Railroads are rapidly expanding across the continent. Factories are booming, pumping out smoke like there's no tomorrow. What a wonderful time to be alive, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Not exactly. Because on the inside, the reality for the average worker was brutal. We're talking about folks literally losing fingers in factory looms and bosses charging them rent just to live in dark, windowless basements.
Section 1. Meet the robber barons, the final bosses of capitalism.
Right, so these are the men who completely defined the extreme wealth of the era, and they made absolutely sure that all the gold ended up strictly in their own pockets. You had true titans who essentially just carved up the American economy. There was John D. Rockefeller completely dominating oil, Andrew Carnegie doing the exact same thing with steel, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who basically owned every train track in existence. I mean, these guys were making so much money they were unimaginably wealthy. We aren't just talking about nice houses here. Their immense wealth allowed them to build literal mansions inside of their mansions. No way, right? But it's true.
Let's zoom in on Rockefeller for a second, because his sheer dominance can be summed up in one massive number: 90%. Just let that sink in. By the time he was done building Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of all the oil in America. He looked at the entire industry and just decided, yeah, I'm going to take all of it.
So how did he actually do it? Well, check out Rockefeller's Monopoly playbook. He used literally every sneaky trick imaginable to crush the competition. Just imagine a small business owner opening a little oil refinery, hoping to get along. Rockefeller's strategy? Step 1, he'd buy the railroad that his competitor desperately needed to transport their oil. Step 2, he'd suddenly double their shipping prices. And Step 3, once they were pushed to the absolute brink of ruin, he'd swoop in and buy out the failing competitor for $3 and a half-eaten popsicle. Seriously, it was exactly that ruthless.
So the crucial point is how these titans managed to get away with this entirely legally. The mechanics of trusts and monopolies can get incredibly complicated, but let's oversimplify it a bit. On one hand, you have these insanely complex legal structures designed specifically to bypass government laws. On the other hand, when they faced pushback, they just threw bags of money at the government until the politicians, well, stopped talking. They essentially made a deal with the government to just do whatever they wanted.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Tammany Hall, the rotting wood underneath. Let's see how this greed bled right into the political sphere. Over in New York City, political corruption was the absolute rule, led by Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. And they didn't run the city government like a public service. Oh no, they ran it like a private club. They forced voter loyalty using pure, unadulterated intimidation. Imagine walking up to vote for someone who wasn't a criminal, and Boss Tweed's crew gently points you towards something they called the National Razor, a literal guillotine, just to ask if you were sure about your vote. And once you brilliantly decided to vote for Tweed, your reward for compliance was a loaf of cheap 12 sous bread that was definitely, absolutely not made with terrible ingredients. The whole system was rigged from the very top down.
Section 3. The Great Upheaval. Life without the gold plating. So while the rich were living their absolute best lives, millions of people were experiencing a very, very different America. The contrast here is devastating. On one side, the veneer, you've got the wealthy throwing these lavish, literal gold-plated parties and building those mansions inside mansions we talked about earlier. On the other side, the reality. The working class enduring brutal 10-hour workdays, living in those cramped, windowless basements, and eating bread that literally had sawdust mixed into it just to make it cheaper for the manufacturers. It was a punishing, crushing existence.
And, eventually, the working class hit a breaking point. I mean, they couldn't survive on the rotting wood underneath the gold any longer. So labor unions finally started forming to demand basic human rights and better conditions. This sparked massive, nationwide strikes breaking out across the entire country. And how did the government, the same government taking bags of money from the monopolies, respond? They sent in the military. Troops were deployed to, quote-unquote, disperse the crowds of workers, which tragically meant that these conflicts escalated into rapid, extremely violent clashes.
Section 4. The Progressive Era. Peeling off the gold.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it all shook out. It was a long, brutal era, but eventually the public woke up. People collectively realized that maybe, just maybe, having 3 guys own the entire country was a completely terrible idea. To ungild the age, the system finally started to correct itself. The government actually stepped up and began actively breaking up these massive monopolies. Those billionaires were finally told to stop putting sawdust in the bread and to start operating with some basic regulations. The gold layer peeled off, exposing the problems so they could actually be fixed. Oh, and as a slight silver lining to all this, Andrew Carnegie did decide to build some pretty cool public libraries with a fraction of his massive steel fortune. So, there's that.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and it leaves us with a massive, provocative question to ponder. Does unchecked greed inevitably lead to a chaotic period of civil unrest? History shows us the extreme lengths to which the Gilded Age was pushed before the working class pushed back, peeling away that shiny gold veneer to deal with the rot underneath. It really makes you look at today's world with a slightly different lens, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the glittering mess of the 1870s. Keep questioning the world around you, and I'll see you in the next explainer.